So in our last week's discussion, we were introduced to thinking about choice under uncertainty, which is a very important tool in thinking about finance. So we'll see, for instance, how it is applied when we are thinking about portfolio optimization. And that is, again, an input into thinking about asset pricing theories. So the discussion actually introduced quite a lot of different concepts at the same time. And so it might be worth going back a bit more slowly and to look at these concepts in more detail. So what we are going to do today is first, we are going to start talking a bit about choice under certainty, which is easier problem relatively compared to choice under uncertainty. And we are going to introduce each of these terms again that you saw last week. So we are going to be thinking about budget sets. We are going to be thinking about utility functions. We are going to be thinking about indifference curves. And then we are going to put them all together and think about how the optimal choice is made. And you'll see that when we again kind of go back to our discussion of choice under uncertainty, you will see perhaps a bit better about how these concepts that are applied when thinking about choice under uncertainty are exactly what we were generalizing when we were thinking about decision making under uncertainty. Now, choice under uncertainty is an interesting problem on its own as well, because this also has quite a lot of different applications in economics and finance. So let us look at the different ingredients. So first, you had this ingredient called budget sets. Now, budget sets were something that we had introduced actually in week 2 as well. So hopefully this is now something where you are getting quite comfortable with the different notions. So imagine that you have a world which has just two goods. You can generalize this further to any number of goods that you want. But for now, let's just deal with the world which has two goods. You can think of this as, for example, let's say a world which has juice as well as chocolates. So these are the only two goods that people can buy, for example, just to fix ideas. So we are going to call one of these two goods good one or commodity one, and the other good we are going to call good two or commodity two. Okay. So we are going to think about a consumer who is making a decision about how much of each of these goods to actually buy versus the other good, how much to buy, right? So imagine that a person is thinking about consuming X1 units of good one and X2 units of good two. Then we are going to be writing it in this notation, right? So particularly suppose that he's thinking of purchasing 5 units of good one and 10 units of good two. This will be written as in bracket 5 comma 10, right? This is the bundle that this person is considering purchasing. Okay. All right. So how do we get from this notion to that of budget sets? So for purchasing each goods, think about that there are price that is associated with each good. So price of P1 per unit of good one and the price of P2 per unit of good two would mean that the total expenditure on these two goods are going to be P1X1 plus P2X2, right? How do we get these numbers? Well, X1 is the amount of good one purchased. P1 is the price per unit of good one. So P1 times X1 is the total price, total amount of money spent on purchasing good one. And similarly, P2X2 is the total amount of money that is spent on purchasing good two. And this sum of the total expenditure, that has to be less than equal to M, where M is the total income that the consumer has in terms of deciding on how much to spend along these two goods, right? Now, in case you were thinking that, does the world only have two goods? Remember, this is just for illustration purposes, right? You can generalize this, but it's just easier to kind of conceptualize. In case it seems to you a bit too abstract, so think about X1 as any good that you might be interested in, and X2 is money that is spent on anything else other than that good, right? So X1 can be, let's say, the amount of money that you are spending on eating out, let's say, and X2 would be the other things on which you spend money. So that can be one way of thinking. Okay. So we have now got the budget set of the consumer, and associated that with that is the budget line of the consumer, right? So this is the boundary of this budget set, and this is the one where in our simplified setup, we are going to have P1X1 plus P2X2 equal to M, right? Again, remember, this is the budget line for our simplified setup. You can have other complicated cases where the price per unit is not constant, but it depends on how much you are consuming. So then you might have interesting nonlinear budget lines and so on. But we are not going to be kind of like dealing with that here. That is something to look forward to if you take a more advanced course in, let's say, microeconomics, right? Okay. And typically, we would also have this restriction that X1 and X2 are non-negative, right? So you want to purchase a positive amount of good, and this is the description of the budget set. So let's look at a simple problem to understand these different aspects. So suppose that Rajesh has an income of 40 units to spend on two commodities. Commodity one costs 10 per unit, commodity two costs 5 per unit, right? So in terms of the notation that we developed here, what we have is M equal to 40, P1 equal to 10, and P2 is equal to 5. So let's look at the set of questions that we are asked to solve. So the first question says that write down the budget equation. So basically equation of the budget line, and interpret the slope of this budget line. Okay. So what is the budget equation? Well, the budget line is given by P1 x1 plus P2 x2 equal to M. So for each unit of commodity one that you're consuming, you have to pay a price of 10. This is the information that was given, right? Because commodity one costs 10 per unit. And for each unit of good two that you are purchasing, the price that you have to pay is 5. So 5x2 is the total amount that you are spending on commodity two, right? So this total amount that you are spending, that is basically adding up to your income. So that's the budget equation, right? Okay. The second thing that you were asked is what does this slope mean, right? So first we need to calculate the slope. So if you take the 10x1 on the other side, then you get that the slope is basically -2, right? So dx2 dx1, which for a line is constant, is -2, right? So what is the significance of this -2? This is saying that if you want to get one more unit of good one, how many units of good two do you have to give up, right? So this is determined by market prices. So you can see that here it's pretty straightforward to see that because commodity two costs 5 units and commodity one costs 10 units. So if you want to get one more unit of commodity one, so you require 10 more units of money. And in order to do that, you have to basically give up 2 units of commodity two, because each of unit of commodity two costs 5. So that's where you get the slope, right? So keep in mind that this is again determined not by what somebody wants, right? But by what the market prices are, right? So that is one thing. Okay. And the other thing to note is that if you were plotting this in x1, x2 space, well, what you will have is that this will be a straight line, which is negatively sloped. In fact, the slope will be -2. And we'll discuss soon what does the intercepts of this line tell us. So the second and the third question asks us to answer this question, that if you have got Rajesh spending all of his income on commodity one, how much is Rajesh going to buy? And if instead Rajesh spends all of his income on commodity two, how much could Rajesh buy? So the way we do that is we look at this budget line. And if you want to think that he wants to spend all of his income on commodity one, so that means he's basically choosing x2 equal to 0. So if we set x2 equal to 0 here, we end up getting 10x1 equal to 40. And so therefore x1 is equal to 4, right? So this says that if Rajesh is spending all of his money on commodity one, then he can buy a maximum of 4 units of commodity one. Similarly, if we want to think about what's the maximum amount of commodity two that Rajesh can buy, we'll set x1 equal to 0 in this equation. And so we end up getting x2 is equal to 8. And so that's the maximum amount that Rajesh can buy. And interestingly, this will be the 2 points, which will be the ones on the intercept of this x2, x1 axis that we mentioned. And these are basically the corner points, right? Where basically you are spending all of your money in only buying one commodity. Okay. The other parts are kind of like asking about what happens if different prices or the income change, right? So for example, suppose that price of commodity one falls to 5 per unit, while everything else remains same. Remember, price of commodity one was initially 10 per unit. Then what would happen to the budget equation, right? So we can follow the same procedure. Instead of 10x1, now we are going to have 5x1 plus 5x2, and it's equal to 40. So there are two things to note. So what happens is when price of something falls, the consumer we'll see is basically better off, right? And the idea is very simple, right? Because whatever you could purchase earlier, you can still purchase. So you can see that if you draw the budget set corresponding to this, which would be 5x1 plus 5x2 less than equal to 40, that is going to be a subset, a strict subset of 10x1 plus 5x2 less than equal to 40, right? So whatever you can buy before, you can still buy. And in fact, you can kind of like buy even more, right? Sorry. So this original one is a subset of this new one, right? Because the price has fallen. So whatever you could have purchased before, you can still purchase now, and you can actually purchase even more things, right? So that is the first thing to note. And the second thing to note is that basically, if you kind of look at the different things from the budget line perspective, what has happened is that the slope has changed, right? So earlier the slope was -2, now the slope is -1. And this is basically reflecting that if you want to purchase one more unit of commodity one, now you have to only give up one unit of commodity two, whereas earlier you had to give up 2 units. And if you look at the intercepts, the intercept on the x-axis has now increased to 8 compared to 4 before, right? So this is basically telling us that you can actually afford to buy more of commodity one now because the price has actually fallen compared to before. But the intercept term in on the x2 axis has still remained the same as 8, right? Because this is because the price of commodity 2 has not changed, and it's only price of commodity 1 has changed. And so essentially, this means that you can actually pivot around this budget line around the point on the intercept on the x2 axis, right? So that's how you would interpret it. Okay, let's look at the other change that that we could have happened. So now suppose that the price of the commodities, two commodities are both 5 per unit, but the income that Rajesh had to spend on these two commodities, which was, remember, earlier 40, has now gone down to 30, right? So what is the effect on the budget equation now? So first, let's write down the budget constraint. So you have got 5 is the price of both of these commodities and 30 is the income. So the budget equation or the budget lines equation is given by 5x1 plus 5x2 equal to 30, right? So if you compare it to before, definitely compared to the one in part 4, now the person is worse off, right? In the sense that the things that he can afford now, which is given by 5x1 plus 5x2 less than equal to 30, that is less than the amount of things that he could afford before. If you compare the slope, for instance, the slope will remain the change because it's only the income has changed, not the relative prices, right? And so therefore the slope is still -1 as it was in part 4. And if you look at the intercepts have both gone down, right? So earlier the intercepts were at 0.8 and 8.0. Now the two intercepts are 0.6 and 6.0, right? So the maximum amount of commodity 1 or the maximum amount of commodity 2 that the consumer can purchase is now just given by 6, whereas earlier it was given by 8, right? So again, if you draw the budget line, this is basically inward parallel shift of the budget line compared to what you had in the previous case. So these are kind of like examples with which you can play around and think about how to think about budget lines. So this is the important two equations. And we'll see that this is essentially going to be an ingredient in the choice problem that we are going to see. The other thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes, as we'll see, this budget line is something that where you have to be a bit more creative in thinking about it, right? So you already saw one example of that when we were discussing the intertemporal budget constraint, but you also saw another example last week as well, when we were discussing the state contingent budget constraint, right? So even though at this point this seems very simple, but you need to have a firm understanding of these basics, and then you can use this to build up on the other kind of like settings that we are going to see. So we'll see more examples of that later this week about how do you think about this budget constraint in different contexts.